As of June 2020, there are 25,000 registered parents waiting to adopt on the Central Adoption Resource Authority, or CARA. However, there are 2,700 children available for adoption. So, what does a child need to have the one thing that they deserve the most? The love, care, and support of a family. Welcome to Care of the State, a podcast by Catalyst for Social Action that sheds light on what happens to orphaned and vulnerable children in India. On this episode of Care of the State, we're talking about adoption. So, what is the process an adoptive parent has to go through to take home a child? What is the Central Adoption Resource Authority, or CARA? And why does there continue to be a stigma around adoption in India? Let's start with understanding what adoption is. In simple terms, adoption means legal transfer. A child who is orphaned, abandoned, or surrendered, according to the Juvenile Justice Act, needs to be declared legally free for adoption by the Child Welfare Committee, which means their biological parents, if alive, won't have any legal rights over the child. Once the child is declared legally free for adoption, they're matched with prospective adoptive parents by CARA, the Central Adoption Resource Authority. It's a body that monitors and regulates adoptions in-country and inter-country. So, unlike what you see in the movies, the hero can't pick up a random child from the street and raise them. In order to complete the adoption process, you would need to follow a comprehensive legal process which involves a whole lot of paperwork. All these measures have been set in place by the government to ensure the safety and stability of the child. To understand the process and system of adoption, our host, Anandhi Yagnaraman, CEO of Catalyst for Social Action, spoke to Smriti Gupta, founder of WAIC, or Where Are India's Children, a child welfare and action foundation.
What is the process of actually adopting children in India for Indian citizens?
So domestic adoptions in India, which is Indian citizens adopting within India, they loosely have about 5 steps. The very first step is registering with CARA. So that's the Central Adoption Resource Authority. It's a central body in India, irrespective of where the person is in India. You could be in Pune, you could be in Delhi, you could be in Andaman, but you're going to register with CARA. The second step is to get home study done. Home study is a vetting process that the parents truly want to adopt and they're ready for it. So that home study is done by a local adoption agency. Then the third step is the step where a parent gets matched with a child. Now that can happen 2 ways. One is that a parent can wait for a referral. So based on when the parent registered, depending upon what criteria they had put during their registration, they can either wait for a referral of a child, or CARA also has these 2 lists of waiting children called a special need list and an immediate placement list. Special need means children who have a specific health need. And the immediate placement list is where there are either older children or children who have gone through a few referrals but haven't been adopted yet. So a person can wait for their referral in step 3 and actively pursue these lists. Then once a person is matched with a child, the 4th step is bringing the child home. So the child comes home under a foster care agreement. In the 5th step, the court approves the adoption is done. So loosely 5 steps for domestic adoption.
How long does it take actually for a parent from the time they register to actually bring the child home? And in your opinion, is the process quick and efficient?
So steps 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 are reasonably quick and efficient for most people. I remember when we adopted our second daughter, at the time, we did the first 2 steps in under a month, because we were on top of our paperwork and we got quickly submitted things as needed. And in 3rd step, once a child is matched with you, the 4th step when the child comes home and the court date, that may take a few extra months, but the child is with you. So you have that extra bonding time. And again, even the court process, the paperwork is very doable. So I would say the bureaucratic part or the paperwork part of it is quite doable, quite efficient, quite transparent. The waiting period comes actually in step 3, when you're waiting to be matched with a child. And that's today, it's happening because there are more people in India who want to adopt a child But the number of children who are free for adoption, legally free for adoption, is much, much less, which is why today there is a wait period, mostly for children who are a bit younger, and they are in what is called the normal category in terms of health. Today, that wait is probably around 2 to 3 years. So quite a bit of wait. Of course, there's no wait for special need children or older children, though overall the wait time is quite high when you're waiting to be matched with a child.
What does it mean to be legally free for adoption? What does that mean?
So legally free for adoption essentially means that the child's biological family no longer has guardianship rights on the child. Let's say when a child is legally free for adoption and a family adopts the child belongs to the adoptive parents. The child has a right in the family of the adoptive parents. So today when somebody adopts a child, if they have, let's say, have property or they have other assets, they will belong to the child as well, just like they'll belong to your biological child. So legally free for adoption means that a child's rights are protected, that somebody can't come back one day and take the child back, that somebody cannot disrupt a child's life, and that the child has full rights in their new family.
Parents who are considering adoption aren't solely from India. There are people who live outside the country who want to adopt as well. According to the current statistics on CARA's website, there have been a little over 3,000 in-country adoptions and 417 adoptions from outside the country between April 2020 to March 2021. Anandhi asks Smriti to explain the process of adoption for those residing outside India.
How is it different for someone who lives abroad, who is not residing in India? How does it work for them?
If you're a foreigner residing outside India, or if you're an OCI residing outside India, you'll have to register, you would have to do your home study, you'll get matched with a child, and then you will go through the due process afterwards to get formal approval for that adoption. Now, the difference is that the level of vetting, the level of paperwork, the level of training, the level of counseling international parents go through is much, much higher than domestic parents. That is why the international adoption process does take longer, because there are two countries, interacting with each other. Child is going from one country to another. So there are a lot more steps to vet that the process is legal, that the process is correct. But as a baseline, the registration, getting matched, and then finishing the process, that baseline stays the same.
According to a report by The Hindu in January 2020, CARA said that on average, there are 4,000 legal adoptions that take place annually within and from India. But a Jena Committee report released in September 2018 stated that there are 3.7 lakh children in childcare institutions. So why is there a glaring disparity in the number of children in childcare and the number of children available for adoption? Firstly, there are so many moving parts to adoption, from the approval processes for the parents who want to adopt to making sure the children are legally free for adoption. Now, in trying to bridge the gaps, Smriti's foundation works to keep track of the children who are currently in care of the state through a digital platform. This online resource alerts childcare institutions, district, state, or government departments as to which children are ready to be legally free for adoption so that officials can start setting things in motion to approve them. They basically pave a path for children to reach the legal adoption pool as quickly as possible. Smriti takes Anandhi through how her organization works.
We did a study of child shelters in 2019-2020, and what we found was a lot of process that needs to happen on the ground. It doesn't happen for the children who needs to come into the legal adoption process. And one of the challenges is that everything today is extremely manual. So let's say you have 2,000 children in a district in child shelters. That's 2,000 files, right? That's 2,000 children spread across, let's say, 50 shelters. Now, for any of that child to go through the legal adoption process, first, correct data has to be there. And then that data has to be constantly reviewed. And somebody has to make sense of that data and move the child forward. Now, to do that in a very manual process, you would require, local authorities and other NGOs to constantly go through children's files every month, every quarter, and then make decisions. Those decisions would also be manually recorded and passed around. So we saw that due to these inefficiencies, the children were slipping through the cracks. When we talked to some of the government authorities, they basically, talked about how they have such lack of bandwidth that they can't even review these children again and again. So that is where our idea of introducing technology into this process came, right? Why don't we digitize the data of children? Why don't we digitize relevant data and then analyze that data and create reports out of it? Create an action plan for the child from those reports. Notify the right authorities about what should be the next step taken for the child. So ultimately, the decision belongs to the government at the local level. But what technology, what good data can give them is give them insights. Give them each child's information on their fingertips. So today, if we were to ask either a district or a state level authority, okay, out of all the children in your shelters, how many are abandoned? How many are orphaned with no guardians listed? How many are orphaned with guardians listed, but those guardians are not raising them? How many are children in shelters because their parents are unwilling to raise them versus how many kids are in shelters because their parents are poor? Now, nobody can share these things. And if you can't share these things, how do you make a next step decision for the child? So that's what we are trying to do with technology. We are ensuring that each child's data is digitized, and not only digitized, it's correctly digitized, the right information is digitized, and it's updated on a regular basis. And then from that information, children can be made visible to local authorities, children's status can be made visible, and the system can also flag children for next steps.
So there are a few children who are now flagged as ready for adoption or legally free for adoption. What happens after that?
Let me clarify one thing. The system cannot flag them as legally free for adoption. That's a process that the government has to do. So once that happens, once the system flags, the dependence is still on the government bodies. The dependence is still on the shelters to take action. So for example, let's say a child is abandoned. When the child was found when he or she was 7 years old, gave some information about their parents, but the parents were never found. Now, in this scenario, a police report would be needed to say that the parents were not found. Then a newspaper advertisement would be needed to ensure that, if there is a biological family, they can come take the child. And if there is none, then, the newspaper advertisement proves that nobody's right now willing to take on this child. So there are a few things that have to be done, and then the child can be declared free for adoption. So similarly, there may be other scenarios as well. So what the platform can do is make things transparent. It can make things easier. It can flag children appropriately so they are not hidden. Right now, they are essentially, it feels like a black box. So the system can throw light on the status of every child in the shelter and flag. But the work, the next step, as you said, belongs to the local authorities, belongs to the shelter to declare the child free for adoption.
Over the years, the process of adoption has seen multiple amendments, not just in the Juvenile Justice Act, but also in our understanding of adoptive parents and coping mechanisms of adopted children. In India, adoption is legal, but not conventional. Ex-Miss Universe winner Sushmita Sen grabbed headlines when she adopted a child in the year 2000. She was 24 and a single parent. 10 years later, she adopted her second daughter. CARA has listed a set of adoption rules for prospective adoptive parents. For example, if a couple wants to adopt, they need to have been in a 2-year stable marital relationship, and both their consent is important. A couple in a live-in relationship is not allowed to adopt. A single man cannot adopt a girl child, whereas there's no gender restrictions for a single woman. The prospective adoptive parents need to be physically, mentally, and emotionally stable and financially capable, and shall not have any life-threatening medical condition. Age is also an important factor that CARA considers when parents decide to adopt. To take us back to her adoption experience in the 70s and 80s, we spoke to Dr. Aloma Lobo, a pediatrician and counselor by profession, and the ex-chairperson of CARA, as well as Adoption Coordinating Agency Karnataka. She brought home her first adopted daughter in 1979. She tells us about the process she went through and draws a comparison to the current system of how things work.
Well, at that particular point of time, it was unusual to adopt a child. The agency itself was very good. The agency was full of children at that time. There were many, many children and very few parents who were willing to adopt. So the questions from the public, from friends, from relatives, from the courts, why do you want to adopt? You've got 3 sons. I mean, you were going to get 3 lakhs of dowry. Why would you want to adopt a girl? Then there were suspicions. Would we want to adopt a girl for ulterior motives? And overall, it was a suspicious sort of ambiance. And the procedure itself was more tedious. It took us 2 years after we got our child into foster care to get the courts to pass the orders. I had to appear in court myself and say, look, we have had this child for 2 years. Would you like to come and see how she is? And the judge was extremely nice, and then that evening he passed the orders. It took 2 years. The second time, it took 1 year. The third time, it was very fast. Today, the process has been streamlined. It does take a long time. There have been procedures set into place which are necessary, mainly in the interest of the child and in the interest of the adoptive parents. Sometimes when you streamline something, the process may be streamlined, but the time factor is not. So with the present system with CARA, it is streamlined, it is more transparent, but something is missing, and that is the human contact. When you do everything online, something is missing. And adopting a child is a very human issue. You should have connect with the agency. You should have connect with the child. You should have connect with his story or with her story. And that's the little thing which is missing today and which I wish somehow we could put back into place. I don't have an immediate solution for that, but somehow parents should be allowed to connect with agencies well before they take the child home. Here, the connect is very short. They go to see the child once the child has been offered to them. And somehow, if there could be some connection, whether it's online, whether it's through videos, and especially today with the pandemic, the connect is even less. People just go connect their child and charge home again by the next available flight or train or bus. So that connect that we had in the past, where we would go and come to the local agency, that's been somehow lost. And especially with special needs children, the connect is all the more important.
CARA has stated that of the 3,200 children adopted by Indian families in 1 year, hardly 50 are those with special needs. Whereas for inter-country adoptions, 400 of the 700 adopted are specially abled. Aloma's youngest adopted child is a special needs child, and she shares her opinion on adoption of children like her daughter.
People are reluctant to adopt a child with special needs because of the stigma. Then again, people are under the impression that if you adopt a child with special needs, whether it's medical, genetic, or whatever, the finances involved will be rather great. And there is absolutely no help given by government or by anybody else. Then again, most people who adopt a child adopt one child, a single child, and they would like that child to be healthy. Then again, medical facilities are hard to come by. Whereas an older child, people are a little reluctant to adopt because an older child comes into the institution much later. And the child does come with a certain amount of baggage, and people here are a little reluctant. But more than that, in our society, I hate to say this, we slot people according to caste, creed, social status, we slot. A baby comes with no slotting. An older child comes in a slot. And I once offered a child of 12 years old in adoption to a beautiful family otherwise. And they said, how can we take her? She looks like our maid. You know, that was a perception that she's older and they've slotted her. Then again, what do we do to create an awareness that every single child is deserving of a family? Special needs children too. First of all, we have to create something to remove the stigma that is there. Especially with older children, we have to educate parents. They have to go through a detailed counseling process. Likewise, parents might be slightly aware that maybe we could take a child with special needs, get them go through a whole process, meet families, but it's not easy. Maybe the government could also offer some kind of incentive for people who adopt children with special needs, like in terms of medical facilities. Then again, schools are not inclusive. And I think one of the most important things is to imply to parents, you adopt a child with special needs, do not sort of sit on the special need, focus on the child. If you focus on the child, you will help your child to deal with everybody around you. And it's not so bad. It's not so bad after that.
Choosing to adopt a child is a huge decision. A prospective parent has to overcome the stigma or bias from friends or family, their own mental blocks, lack of information, the system and the procedures of adoption, and the eventual process of being matched with a child, and so on. It's a long and emotional process for both the parent and adopted child. And one of the most heartbreaking aspects of adoption is an issue called disruption. Simply put, it's like divorcing the child you promised to raise. From 2015 to 2019, there have been 246 cases of disruption, which means every 6 in 400 children are being returned at an advanced stage of adoption. Aloma explains why this happens.
Perhaps one of the main reasons is to hurry up and give these children an adoption because they are difficult to place, whether they are older or whether they are children with special needs. In the first place, any family that opts for a child that is older, they have to go through extensive counseling. Adopting an older child is not the easiest thing in the world. The child comes with baggage, with probably a history of abuse, of tremendous trauma. The family must go through a phase of counseling where they understand what the condition might be, what it might entail. No child comes to you wanting to be grateful, but a child comes to you terrified of the change he's been put through. Parents have to be made aware of that. Then again, very often parents who have taken an older child and returned the child did not originally opt for an older child. They had originally opted for a younger child, and then because it would take so long, they said, okay, we will take that child from the immediate placement list and said, we will take that child, the child will come soon. Or we'll take the child with special needs, the child will come in 2 weeks. And that's wrong. When a couple changes their option, they should be recounseled. Again, when the child is offered to them, the condition of the child should be assessed. They should be aware of it. They should be given time to decide, can I really do this? Do I want this? Because most of the children who have been returned have been children who have been slightly older and a sibling groups and a child with an undiscovered condition, maybe a medical condition or something. Then again, I'm not happy when parents decide to take a child suddenly and immediately from an immediate placement list, unless they had opted for such a child beforehand. You don't return a child. The trauma to that child is immeasurable. And keep in mind, half the time when the child comes to you, an older child, and he gives quote unquote trouble, he's testing you out. He's actually testing, say, will you still love me when I'm a pain in the neck? Will you still love me? And then you say, no, I'm giving you back. That reinforces the fact that I'm not lovable.
Prospective parents who want to adopt tend to ask for infants or children between the age of 0 to 2 years. However, that constitutes only 1/5 of the total number of children who are legally free for adoption, which means that the majority of children that are in need of a family and a home are either older or have a disability. You have to consider that adoption is not about bringing home the shiniest kid. It's about providing love, care, and protection to a child deprived of relationships and a place called home. To top it all, disruption is an added traumatic experience for both the child and the parent. So what happens when a child gets returned to the adoption agency or child care institution? Do they get another shot at being adopted? Aloma simplifies the process of disruption.
If they're still pre-completion of the legalities, there's not much of a process. They can just inform the agency they're returning the child and the child goes back. But if they've gone through the legalities, then there's a big problem. The case has to be rescinded in court again. If they've completed the legal process and they've got full custody, then the case they'll have to go back to court. First, they go through a counseling process. We've done that in the past, where we try and help them counsel the child. The child should also go through counseling, help them to deal with it. Sometimes it's been successful, but sometimes if it's not successful, they've got to go back and return the child, and then the case is rescinded in court before the child can be placed again in adoption.
And I suppose this would be much more complicated for parents who have actually adopted from being abroad.
See, what happens with parents who have adopted from abroad, the child already has a foreign passport. So the child will be replaced in that country. Very few of the time will the child be returned to India. Take in the US, for example, before the child goes, he gets his green card. And by the time he arrives in the US, he gets immigration. Or he might even get his immigration before he goes. So he's now a US citizen. And if the family don't want him, they return him back to child services or whatever service they have over there. And then they will keep the child and they can replace the child with an appropriate family.
A child goes through irreparable trauma when they're returned by adoptive parents. And just as there are parameters set for a child to be legally free for adoption, prospective parents have to be declared legally fit to adopt. Being an adoptive parent herself, Anandhi asks Aloma about the criteria that's needed.
Is there anything on the parents being cleared for adopting the child?
Of course. The parent has to go through a whole phase of a home study. A home study is actually almost call it an investigative report into the reasons why a parent wants to adopt, why they want to adopt. Are they both in unison in their decision? How does the family feel? What are their facilities available? And it's also a reason for the couple, again, to reevaluate why they want to adopt a child. Some couples during the home study have said, hey, this is not for us. And some couples have gone deeper and said, yeah, we're really glad we're talking about all this because we had these deep-seated fears and concerns which have now come to the surface. So yes, there is a home study process that they have to go through. In our country, it's much shorter. In America and all, it takes 6 to 8 months to go through that process. In Spain and in some parts of Europe, it takes nearly 2 years for the couple to be trained into the process of adoption. In our country, it's a bit faster, yeah. But it's supposed to be detailed.
So do you really think that there are sufficient counseling services and support mechanisms both for the parent and for the child in these cases?
Well, this is where social workers who are doing your paperwork have to be properly trained. You cannot do an intake form kind of home study. The home study has to be extensive and really detailed. And in the metropolitan cities, I do believe that there are an adequate number of social workers. But one important thing, doing a parent's home study is not just a job. The person should be actually personally involved and invested in the adoption. Because unless you're really invested, you are never going to really care what the outcome might be. The social worker must be invested in what they're doing. And I think that used to happen a long time ago. But now with everything really divided over several institutions, perhaps some social workers are not completely trained or invested in this whole job of counseling.
Indian couples face a lot of pressure to have biological children. And this pressure converts into opposition when they decide to adopt. There isn't enough information and support available for adopted parents. Making the decision to adopt is hard enough, but also understanding how best to support a child who's gone through trauma is also important. Anandhi asked Smriti about the kind of help that's available to prospective adoptive parents as well as adopted children.
What kind of support is available for parents who are thinking about adoption, who want to consider it and maybe mull over it and come back, ask questions, get reassurance?
I would like the people who are around the adoptive parents, whether they are grandparents, whether they are relatives, whether they are neighbors, friends, they need to self-educate themselves about adoption. I remember when I adopted my daughters, a lot of what people around me said didn't matter because I had done my research and I was very confident, I was very sure. But not every parent comes from that place. They seek advice from people around them. They look to people around them. And when the people around them don't understand adoption, they may not give the best support or advice for the best interest of the child. I think we need to start talking more about all types of adoption. So kind of get out of this, only people who cannot naturally have children will go then adopt a baby, right? We have to really get out of that mode and start highlighting parents who adopt kids with special needs, start highlighting parents who have adopted older children. Talk about all types of adoptions so that more and more people who may be thinking about it but are not sure, right? It can change their mind. Or somebody who's on the fence, who's sort of thinking, okay, I'll adopt, may find out this information and then decide, okay, actually, I'm going to go adopt an older child or I'm going to go adopt a sibling group. I think the adoptive parent community is a big support. But what I would also like to see is, pediatricians, therapists, child psychologists, all of them specializing in adoption. Because that is where I believe there is a huge lack in India, that as an adoptive parent, if you feel, okay, I want to take my child to a therapist for something, can they account for the fact that the child did go through an adoption and how that may or may not impact the child? So we are lacking that in terms of professionals available. And I think that needs to be built up.
What kind of support exists for kids who have been adopted? They have a lot of questions. Are there any services available for adopted children?
I do think there are adoption counselors available now. Not too many, but some counselors available who can be a resource to teenage kids. A lot of times what adoptive parents do is they tend to form these informal groups with other adoptive parents, especially if the children are of same age. So the children can talk to other kids who were adopted and kind of have a community of that. So I've seen some of the parents do that for the lack of, formal or professional help. They may get their child connected to other children who have gone through a similar experience. I think a lot more needs to be done in that area. Today, the way I see a lot of parents supporting their kids is by educating themselves. So the parents would themselves read books, read articles, get self-educated, how to support a teenager who was adopted, and then go from there.
According to a 2018 report in The Wire, despite India being home to millions of children without parents, there's also a rising number of infertile couples. For most of them, adoption is the last choice. An Indian Express article published in May 2021 stated that a substantial number of families that are registering for adoption are not doing it only because of infertility. There is a new trend. What is it? Anandhi asks Smriti.
So do you also find that there is an increasing trend of people having their own biological children and also adopting the second one? How is the first child going to adjust with the second one? Do you see anything in that area?
Oh, yes, definitely. I would say people like me who have only adopted are a huge minority, right? Like at least what I see in parent groups. Now there's this increasing trend of people saying, I'm going to have one biological child and I'm going to adopt one child, right? I'm seeing it increasingly common. In fact, there are a lot of families where they have two biological kids because, they got married and the family pressure had two kids and then eventually decided to adopt and then went for it. I'm seeing that a lot as well. In terms of adjustment, I would say kids adjust with each other. They may fight, they may play, they may do whatever. Kids adjust to each other. It's the parents who need the adjustment mostly, right? They are the ones who need to stop thinking, okay, how will my bio kid react? How will my adopted child react? They're both your kids. They'll be fine. Leave them alone. Let them bond. Let them be. The kids will be fine. I think the parents need to relax a bit.
Are there specific trends that you see in the adoption in terms of parent preferences or age of children? Anything that you see over the years?
So yes, I think adoption has changed quite a lot. And I would say even within the last 5 years, I still hear some people say things like, oh, people in India, this mindset, that mindset, they won't adopt. But that's not true. There may be people who have certain mindset or biases towards adoption, but there are a lot of people today in our country who are willing to adopt. Especially when I talk to the younger generation, the younger professionals. Every single person I talk to, right, they have considered adoption. They have thought about adoption. They do want to adopt one day. So I think the acceptability and the sensitization towards adoption is increasing in our country. The second trend I see is, historically the notion has been that the children who get adopted are the babies, are the perfectly healthy babies. And I think that's also changing. In the last year, I think I have counseled a lot more people about older child adoption than I have done in, let's say, last 5 years. I don't have exact stats on this, but if I just look at it anecdotally and based on my experience, I do see that people are shifting towards adopting even older children, even pre-teens and teens. And people are also slowly opening up towards special need adoption, which is a big deal because about 50% of the children who come into the legal adoption process have some type of a special need, minor or bigger than that. That is a trend I'm seeing. I can't say how fast that trend is, but I do hope it picks up.
Dr. Aloma Lobo has 6 children, 3 biological sons and 3 adopted daughters. So did she have to convince her sons about bringing home more siblings? Aloma reveals what happened.
Well, our children, to us, to my husband and to myself, the fact of biology and the fact of adoption both had equal value in our own minds. It wasn't something that was thrust upon us. It was something that we wanted to do. And to us, it was quite natural, like how we would talk to our children about when you were born. We would talk to our girls about when you came home. And in our minds, we knew that they wouldn't really understand the full impact of what adoption really meant until they understood what reproduction was all about. So we used to talk to them, when you came home. And I remember my first child, her first question was, we'd just come back and she said, Mama, she was about 4 years old or 3.5, 4. She said, Mama, these boys are talking such rubbish. I said, what did they say? She said, they came from your tummy. So did they come from your tummy? So I said, yes. And she said, yuck. And then she said, where did I come from? And all I said was someone else's tummy. And that was the start of the conversation. It was never that I gave her the whole spiel. It was always just answering or discussing what was at hand. And we spoke very naturally and normally about it. Adoption to our children was never a secret. Because if it's a secret, then it means there's something quite wrong with it. So we always spoke about it easily and comfortably. And it is important when you adopt a child, if you have other children, to tell them about it. You don't need their permission. but you need them to be on board to think it's okay, to adopt a child.
The adoption process comes under the purview of the courts, which means that it can only be completed and finalized when an order from the court has been obtained. Due to this, there is always an overwhelming backlog, with each case taking years to be decided. In a recent amendment of the Juvenile Justice Act in August 2021, they found a way to speed up the process. Anandhi asks Aloma about the effect this amendment will have.
So there's a recent amendment introduced in the Juvenile Justice Act that actually gives the district magistrate the power and the authority to pass the adoption orders. What's your opinion on that? Is it going to make things faster? Is it going to make it better?
It should be quicker, and it's more local, so it would be quicker. I think the matter was not adequately discussed in Parliament. It should have been properly discussed, and there was a lot of dissension which wasn't addressed. And I think it's a very important thing, because the district judges can now monitor the CWC, monitor the agencies, monitor the whole process of adoption. And I think only time will tell if they've been adequately trained. You see, the average person, you have to be really involved with adoption for a period of time to be able to understand the nuances. It's a very new subject. It took many, many years for it to come to where it is right now. And I think it'll take a few more years for it to come up to this level, for everybody to understand what adoption is really all about, to understand unusual cases. I think only time will tell, yeah.
And of course, we come to now, in the throes of a pandemic. According to an affidavit filed by the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights, the Supreme Court was informed that over 1 lakh children were abandoned, became orphans, or lost one of their parents due to COVID-19 or other reasons between April 1st, 2020 and August 23rd, 2021. Anandhi asks Aloma to give us a reality check on what happened on ground.
So the last 2 years of COVID, has anything changed in the adoption space?
COVID doesn't do anything that's good. First of all, some agencies really suffered from lack of finances. They had to be helped out. The whole process, everything came to a standstill. People couldn't travel, so children sat in the agencies longer than they had to. The connect was much less. The courts were closed. So yes, everything came to a standstill, and now is slowly moving forward again. I must add that after everything opened up a bit, the pace got much quicker and much faster. But there was a certain lag.
Adoption is a very personal decision. And to go ahead with it, you could have multiple reasons. While on the one hand, you have prospective adoptive parents waiting to take a child home. On the other, you have children who are longing to find their adoptive family. But somehow, the annual number of adoptions do not seem to cross the 4,000 mark. Why? Smriti explains the reason behind this gap and suggests changes that can make the process more effective, the system more efficient, and citizens more aware.
So people are willing to adopt. Today, this gap exists because we are not bringing kids into the legal adoption process. We are not making enough eligible children legally free for adoption. So if an abandoned child or an orphan child comes into a shelter, by law, that child has to become legally free for adoption. But that doesn't happen today. You can say many shelters may not want to do the extra work. Many don't think that it is their job to put kids into the legal process. They may just think it's their job to keep the children. Then the enforcement is very lax. As per law, if you're a child shelter and you do not bring an abandoned or orphan child into the legal adoption process, you can be fined and closed. Personally, I don't know of a single shelter that was fined or closed for that reason. So the enforcement in that area is very lax. And a fourth thing is, there's a certain amount of groundwork required to make these kids legally free for adoption. As I said, you may need a police report. You may need to put a newspaper advertisement. Let's say the child vaguely remembers some district they were in before they were found begging or they were found by the police, right? Somebody has to go and search that area and exhaust all possibility of finding a biological family, then come back, give a report so the child can go into adoption. So what happens at the ground level, many people seem to claim, at least from the government side, that the bandwidth is not there to do all this. That child protection requires more resources. Bringing these children into the legal adoption pool requires more resources. The second thing that needs to happen is our country, there's basically zero awareness about the fact that a child can be legally and anonymously surrendered at an adoption agency. So every so often we keep hearing news about a child being abandoned, a child being killed, and so on, right? Like all of that is utterly unnecessary. Why not safely surrender that child? The child will get to a family, the child won't be harmed, the parents won't be arrested for abandoning the child. So massive awareness is needed in that particular area. And the third issue that I see in my work is I think we need better clarity on our laws. Some of our laws are designed in a manner that it leaves a lot of things open to interpretation on the ground. So when you have a person on the ground declaring a child legally free for adoption, they do not want the liability of somebody telling them, you didn't take the right step because the law was not clear. So the interpretation of the law on the ground tends to be extremely conservative, which stops kids from coming into the legal adoption process. So our laws need to be clearer and our laws need to be more adoption friendly. What we do on the ground is if a child has any relative alive on paper, we keep that child forever in a shelter. That's a big issue for a large number of kids we see. So what happens? The parents may have passed away and the relative put the child in a shelter. But because that relative exists, even though they are not raising the child, that prevents that child from getting into the legal adoption process. On similar grounds, let's say if the child was found begging and the parents were never found after that, the child is brought into the shelter and termed missing or, family not traceable. Now, how long can a child be missing? Right? Like there has to be an upper limit for finding the parents. Like maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 8 months, maybe it's a year. There has to be a limit after which we say, okay, the parents are not going to be found. They're obviously not interested in finding the child. Unfortunately, even if there is a remote possibility of some relative existing somewhere, even, 10 states away, the child will get stuck in a shelter. Our law today says an orphan child with no one to care for should be brought into the legal adoption process. So what do you mean no one to care for? Do you mean all relatives have to be dead? Like what is the chance of that happening? That's not going to happen. And even if that person is not raising them, not caring for the child, not visiting them, is incapable of raising the child has to continue in a shelter. So that's a big shift we have to do, not just in implementation, but I think also in legal clarity.
Adoption is neither an act of charity nor a taboo. It's a decision that stems from the urge to provide love and care to a child who needs it the most. It's the moral responsibility of adoptive parents to nurture the child and give them a home and family no different from that of a biological child. Adoption is a tool that can shatter archaic mindsets and catalyze a change in the lives of the vulnerable children of India by giving them support that'll help them thrive in this world. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Care of the State, a series by Catalyst for Social Action. We would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or want to get involved in the work that we do, write to us at connect@csa.org.in. Conceptualized and hosted by Satyajeet Mazumdar. Marketing and Communications by Henal Shah, Pranay Jajodia, and Kinjal Mehta. The creative team were Anuja Kokani and Shahaji Patil. This is a Made in India production. Writer and project manager, Veda Sushila Mohan. Production head and editor, Joshua Thomas. Sound mixing by Karthik Kulkarni. Project supervisor, Sean Phantom. And voiceover by Mariam Thomas.